Guys, how many of you like country music? How many of you guys like country music? Wow, we have a lot of people from Norco here today. So I don't know if you know this about country music. How many of you country music fans actually know where country music came from? You know where country music came from? Well, let me explain to you a little of the history of where country music actually comes from. We actually came out of the Roaring 20s. And in the Roaring 20s, what you will find is that for the first time in our nation's history, more people now were living in the cities than they were on the farms. And because of that proximity, there was an interconnectedness amongst the population of our country that we had never, ever experienced before. Like for the first time with even the invention of mass production, that our country, that we were driving the same cars, that we were purchasing the same products, that we were speaking the same slang words, that we were doing the same dances, and for the first time ever, we were even listening to the same music. Now, in the 20s, what you will find is that the sound of music was a little bit more in terms of big bands singing patriotic marches like Stars and Stripes Forever. Dun, 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 dun. Or it had us doing the Charleston, like dun, 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 dun. I know, it's good, right? It's good. I took lessons for a week in order to do that. But then what you find is that during the 20s, the landscape of music started to change. And it was this law called Prohibition that, believe it or not, was not only changing the way that we consumed alcohol, but it was also changing the way that we consumed music, because no longer were we going to these large venues in order to listen to big bands, but instead we were going to these small little speakeasies to listen to these smaller, more instrumental bands that were assembling. We come out of the 20s into an era called the Great Depression. And the Great Depression, what you'll find is that one of the worst situations in the history of our country not only produced a lack of wealth, but it produced a surplus of wealth in the creative arts. You know, we find that during any time of tragedy in a person's life or in a nation's life. You take, for example, the turmoil and the conflict that our country found themselves in during the Vietnam War. We had this plethora of rock music that was being created during the time, and the Great Depression was no different, because during this extremely difficult time, we had some of the most creative, some of the most iconic American music that was being created, like jazz, like blues, and like country music. Songs like, "You're the Reason Our Kids Are So Ugly." That's a real song, by the way. I don't know if you know that. "I Still Miss You, Baby, but my aim's getting better." Yeah, how does the old country music song go? That when you play it backwards, that you get your dog back, you get your truck back, that you get your wife back. And part of the reason why we all love country music, well, why you all love country music, anyway, is because it's not afraid to talk about how horrible life is. And because of that, there's something that resonates within inside of us. Well, you and I know this, that we are in the middle of the biggest country music song in the Bible, named the book of Job, and it's sadder than anything that Garth Brooks could ever sing about. What we find in the book of Job is that Job has lost everything. That he's lost his family, he's lost his dog, he's lost his truck, he's lost his job, he's lost everything. Here he is, sitting on top of a trash heap with his head shaved, his face swollen, and if you look close enough, you might even find worms that are crawling through some of his sores. Now, one of the things that we've learned about Job is that Job was an extremely affluent man. And in my experience of meeting affluent men, this is what I've realized, that not only are people who are affluent, but usually they are relatively influential as well. That here you have people who are affluent, a lot of times they have a huge network of people that they are connected to, right? I mean, maybe because they have a huge number of employees that they have following them. Maybe because that there are other people who are constantly seeking their leadership advice, or maybe that there's a large number of connections that have led to their own success getting up to that point. All I know is this, that a lot of times the affluential people have a lot of connections. They have a lot of friends. So imagine as Job is going through everything that he is going through, that his phone is just absolutely exploding at this moment with people going, "Oh, Job, I'm so sorry for your loss." You know, his Twitter page, just blowing up with people going, "Job, please let me know if there's anything we can do for you." But then imagine our surprise as only 3 people show up to Job's door. The Bible calls them Job's friends. Their names are Bildad, Zophar, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. I wanted to name my boys that, but that was just because I refused to name him Hunter. He has 3 friends that come to him. We're going to find out a little bit later in the book that there was a 4th friend named Elihu who apparently was there the entire time, just didn't feel the need to speak because he was the youngest one out of everybody, which I wish my 3-year-old felt exactly the same way. But however, what we're going to find is this, that whenever you hear about Job's friends, that whenever you read about Job's friends, we're always thinking and assuming the worst. Because what you're going to find is that over the course of the next 39 chapters, their conversation between them and Job is going to start out relatively mild, but is going to get more and more contentious. It is going to get more angry, and it is going to get louder and louder and louder as the conversation progresses. So we usually talk about everything that Job's friends did wrong, and believe me, we're going to get to that. We're going to talk about that over the next couple weeks. But today we simply want to focus on one thing before we get to everything that Job's friends did wrong, and that is that today we simply want to focus on what Job's friends first did right. If you have your Bibles, would you turn to Job chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. Job chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. Would you all stand with me? Even out in the cafe, would you guys all stand with me as we honor the reading of God's word this morning? Job chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. It says this: When Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz the Termite, Elizabeth the Shuhite, and Job the Namathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and, would y'all say that word with me? To go and sympathize with him and to, would y'all say that word with me? And to comfort him. We're going to put a pin on that and come back to that in just a second. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. And they sat on the ground with him for 7 days, for 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. Before you sit down, would you turn to someone and say, "You've got a friend in me"? You've got a friend in me. You've got a friend in me. Ha, 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 ha. You know, my wife makes fun of me because I only know the first line to every Christmas carol. So I'm always like this: the first Noel. I digress. Okay, so this is what we know about Job's friends, that they all set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and to sympathize and to comfort him. We want to go ahead and stop there for a second, because out of everything that they did and out of everything that we're about to hear and see over the course of the next couple chapters, when things get angrier and angrier and angrier and angrier, what we always have to fall back on is the motive of why Job's friends came to him to begin with, because all of that is going to get lost in all of the words that we're going to read from here on out. We're not going to think that they came to do any good. We're going to think that they came to judge judge him, that they came to heap guilt upon guilt upon guilt. But what we have to do is go back to their original intention that the Scripture allows us a sneak peek on, and that is that they came for the purpose of sympathizing and comforting him. So the next time you get all mad at your friend for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, here's one of the things that you got to be able to evaluate in your own heart. Did they mean good or did they mean bad? Because if they meant good, then it's a little bit easier. And as Christians, I think we should try and give grace to that person. What does the Bible go on to say? The Bible goes on to say this, that when they saw him from a distance, they couldn't even recognize their friend. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes, they sprinkled dust on their heads, they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. They came to him, they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and for 7 nights. This would become such a powerful act that this would now be adopted as a part of Jewish society called sitting Shivas with somebody, or literally translated, it was this idea of sitting sevens with somebody. That I would not simply bring them a meal, that I would not just simply tell them, hey, let me know if there's anything that I could do for you, but that what I would do is I would go and be with them and not necessarily sit with them in silence, but just to go and support them over the course of the next 7 days. That for 7 days, they just kind of sat there with him in love and support for their friend who was going through a difficult moment at the time. And so today, what we're going to do, if this is okay, is we're going to switch gears for a moment, because so far in the book of Job, what we've talked about is our ability to suffer well. Today, we're not going to talk about our ability to suffer well as much as we're going to talk about how you and I can be a good friend to someone else that is suffering well. How do I help someone else who is going through a difficult time? How do I do that? Principle number 1, if you're writing notes, you can go ahead and write this down. That is this right here. Friends care enough to come without being asked. That friends care enough to come without being asked. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that nowhere in the Scripture does it say that somebody else came to his friends and go, you call yourself friends? You're just sitting there watching TV? You know what you should be doing? If you call Job your friend, you should really go and visit him and do something. In fact, what we do not see is that we do not see Job texting his friends saying, hey, you remember how you told me if there's anything that you can do for me to go ahead and let you know? Well, what I'd really love for you to do is take 7 days off of work, file for a vacation, come sit with me in silence for the next 7 days. In fact, here's what I want to do, if only for a moment. I want to parse that phrase, please let me know if there's anything I can do for you. I want you to think about that for a second, because we all say that to someone else as they're going through a time of tragedy. Please let me know if there's anything I can do for you. What you have to understand in the ethos of somebody else who is going through a tragedy is that, number one, they are incapable of making decisions because they are overwhelmed by the situations of life. Number two, they are apologetic. They are the ones who are apologizing to you for some reason about how their tragedy has not only affected their life, but how their tragedy has affected your life. And the question I want to ask is this: when was the last time you said that and somebody actually told you something that you could do for them? Here's a great idea. Instead of asking someone, hey, if there's anything I can do for you, let me know. I got a great idea. Why don't you just do something? Why don't you just do something for them? Anything. But I don't know what to do. Is that even really the point? If the other person's on a diet and you bring them a chocolate pie, do you think they're going to be like, really? Don't you know that I'm on diet right now? You think they're going to do that? No, here's what they're going to do. They're going to say this. Hey, thanks so much for doing that. You want to maybe come inside and have a piece with me? You know why they're going to say that? Because one of the greatest fears of someone who is going through a tragedy is this. Am I going to end up suffering through this all alone? And am I going to have anyone in the world that's going to walk through this situation with me? All I'm trying to say is this, that real friends don't need an invitation. Real friends just come. Real friends just do something. Let me tell you this. When I was in the hospital, after my accident, there were two people that showed up at the hospital immediately. That was my wife, and that was Tom. And let me tell you, Tom wasn't Pastor Tom. Tom was Deputy Tom when he came. He was like kicking in doors. It's a long story. It was a crazy situation at the time, but man, he was crazy. I love that side of Tom, the Deputy Tom. If you show up to a wedding uninvited, that's a big deal. What are you called when you show up to a wedding uninvited? You're a wedding crasher, right? But is there such thing as a funeral crasher? I mean, except for in the movie Wedding Crashers. No, there's no such thing as a funeral crasher. There's a reason why they don't send out invitations to a funeral, and that's because real friends don't need an invitation. Real friends just come. But therein lies the challenge. Therein lies the challenge of how do we encourage and how do we uplift, how do we properly minister to the person who is going through a major tragedy? Because we all think to ourselves, but what do I do? What do I do for the person who just got diagnosed with cancer? I mean, there's nothing that I could possibly do that would make that situation better. What do I say? What do I say to the person who just lost their baby? What do I say to the person whose spouse just committed suicide? I don't know what to say in a situation like that. So you know what we do as people? We go to their funeral. We say, I'm sorry for your loss. You know, we wave to them in the hallways at church. And then after the dust settles, you know what we do? We do nothing. We say nothing. Because we don't know what to do. And we don't know what to say. And if you do want to encourage that person in a situation like that, here's the first bit of advice that I have for you. And that is this principle right here. Don't be the non-question asking friend. Don't be the non-question asking friend. I'm not talking about you and complete strangers. This is not a sermon on how to make friends. This is a sermon on how to be a good friend. Okay? So in that vein, here is my counsel for you. Do not be the non-question asking friend. Do you know who the non-question asking friend is? It's the friend that knows that you lost your job, that your wife cheated on you, that you killed the both of them in a crime of passion, that you're about to rob a liquor store and hide out in Mexico for the rest of your life, and yet the only thing that he can seem to talk about is how hot it is in the Inland Empire. You could have a mask on your face about to rob a liquor store. And he's like this, man, sure is hot in here. Sure is hot in here. Yes, it's so funny that if I were to shatter my arm, if I were to absolutely shatter my arm and have a cast, on my arm. And if I were to come to church on Sunday, everybody in the world, right, would be like, oh my gosh, what happened to you? Are you kidding? Are you okay? Did you run in front of a truck again? Or like, what happened? Everybody would want to talk about it, right? Everyone. When I came to church with a neck brace on, for the people who hadn't heard, they came up to me. Everybody out of the woodwork wanted to talk about it, wanted to say, oh, you okay? What happened? Did you? Blah, 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 blah. But isn't it interesting how when you hurt your body, everybody wants to talk about it. But if you go through a significant life event that shatters your emotions and your souls to pieces, then guess what? You ain't gonna hear a peep out of anybody, including myself. You know why? Because I don't know what to say. You could lose a baby, and yet for me, the only thing I'm going to talk about is how the angels are doing over the course of that weekend. And the reason why I'm not talking about it isn't because I don't care. The reason why I'm not talking about it is because I'm so afraid of upsetting you. Only to realize that I cannot remind somebody who's struggling with cancer that they have cancer, right? I'm not going to go up to somebody and say, so how's your cancer doing? They're like, what? Totally forgot. Until you reminded me. Thanks a lot. Only to realize that you can't remind them of something like that it's only something that they think about all the time, every single day. And so if you want to be a loving, compassionate Christian, here's the principle that you have to understand right here. And the principle is this: even the people who have endured the worst want to talk about it. Even the people who have endured the worst, they want to talk about it. I remember talking to a woman at church one time who had lost her husband, and I said, hey, so-and-so, would it be okay if I talked about your husband up front at church? Because I was like, does she want that? Does she want it to be public? I don't know. And she said, you know what? I would love that. Because I'm just so afraid that his memory is just going to end up being forgotten. Somebody else whose child died at 9 years old of a brain tumor, and he said this, that my child dies a second time when no one speaks their name. And some of you might be in a situation where you're like, you know what, Mark, that sounds all nice to just talk about it with somebody, but I tried that and it didn't work. Because I went to somebody and I was like this, so, tell me how you're doing. And they were like this, how do you think I'm doing? My husband's dead. And it's like, whoa, well, besides that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play? You're like, but here's what you have to understand, that what you're trying to do is you're trying to be a release valve. You're trying to be a safety valve. And whenever you release that pressure is always going to come out most violently and most vigorously, most forcefully in the beginning, right? And if you don't allow that person to release, then what's going to end up happening? That person's going to end up exploding. So what you have to understand as friends is that you did not upset them because they were already upset to begin with, right? You were just allowing them the opportunity to release some of that pressure that was already inside of them. So principle number 1 is this: don't be the non-question asking friend. Principle number 2 is this, right here: learn to be an empathetic Christian. Learn to be an empathetic Christian. For the love of God, would you learn to be an empathetic Christian? Romans chapter 12, verse 15 says this, that we are to what? Is it up there? Yes. That we are to what? We are to rejoice with those who rejoice. And that we are to, even in the cafe, that we are to weep with, that we are to mourn with those who mourn. We are to weep with those who weep. We are to mourn with those who mourn. This is the best translation that I could come up with of that verse right there. And here it is in the Mark International Version, the MIV. Nobody wants your stupid advice, is what I'm talking about. No one wants your stupid advice. Let me tell you what the worst thing that you can say to someone else who is going through a difficult time. The worst thing that you can say is this: don't worry, everything's going to be okay. You know what the other person is thinking? The other person is thinking this: how do you know that everything's going to be okay? You know what's the worst thing that we can say to somebody who's going through a difficult situation? For us to be like this, for you to use cheap, pithy little statements like, don't worry, God's got this. God's in control, that God's going to work good for all those who love him, and who you're going to bring an altar right in front of that person and have like an altar call in the moment, where what you may be communicating at that time is this: that your thoughts and your feelings are stupid. And if you could be brave like me, and if you could be faith-filled like me, then everything would be fine. Can I tell you this? A lot of Christians, you know what we want to do in a situation like that? We don't want to befriend people, we want to fix people. Because if I can just go ahead, wrap a nice little Bible verse on your wound and walk away and know that everything's going to be fine, then it's not going to bother you and it's not going to bother me anymore. What you find for a lot of people is that during a time of tragedy, they find themselves not surrounded by people, they find themselves surrounded by platitudes. Platitudes like, everything's going to be okay. Don't worry. Be happy. When I think what we need to learn how to do in that situation is to learn how to be empathic. To rejoice with those who rejoice, but to learn even more so, not to fix those who mourn, but to mourn with those who mourn. You know what that means? That means that you and I begin to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, not adding to the burden that they feel, not trying to fix their problems in the moment, but trying to understand how it is that they might be feeling to begin with. You know what you do? You take what they're feeling and you say this: wow, that sounds really scary. Instead of saying, don't worry, God's got this, let somebody tell themselves that. Does God, I'm not refuting that God's got it. I'm just saying, are you able to walk in another person's shoes and to say, wow, that sounds really scary? Could you tell me about that? Could you talk to me about that a little bit? Because I don't understand what it's like to have cancer. I don't understand what it's like to be on the verge of losing my mom or my house. And I feel sorry for you, but would you help me? Empathy, empathy, empathy. There's somebody who started selling empathy cards because they felt like everybody was just, sucked at it so bad. So I love these empathy cards. Here's a first empathy card. It says this right here. It says, please let me be the first to punch the next person who tells you that everything happens for a reason. And then it says this at the bottom: I'm sorry you're going through this. Here's a second card that I love. I'm so sorry that you're sick. I want you to know that I will never try and sell you on some random treatment I read about on the internet. When somebody just tells you that they have a condition, Christian, put away your essential oils, okay? Like, oh my goodness. Okay, you laughed, that means you got it. Nobody wants to hear about your stupid essential oils, okay? Oh man, I'm gonna get more hate mail over that one than anything else I've ever preached on in this church. Here's the third one. When life gives you lemons, I promise I won't tell you a story about my cousin's friend who died of lemons. And the fourth one, I need to have a whole bunch of these cards that I just send to people. I'm really sorry I haven't been in touch. I didn't know what to say. Empathy. More than your advice, I think what your friend needs most is you. There's a man named Joe Bailey and his wife Mary Lou that lost all 3 of their children to death. The first son they lost after his surgery when he was only 18 days old. The second they lost at 5 years old because of his cancer. Finally, they lost their third son at 18 years after a sledding accident, some complications because of his hemophilia. And in Joe Bailey's wonderful book, The View from a Hearse, he writes this. I was sitting torn by grief, and someone came and talked to me of God's dealings and of why it happened and hope beyond the grave. And he talked constantly, and he said things that I knew to be true, except I was unmoved. And I wished that he would just go away. And finally, he did. Another came and sat beside me, and he didn't talk. He didn't ask his leading questions. He just sat beside me for an hour or so and listened when I said something. Answered briefly, prayed simply, and then he left. I was moved. I was comforted. I hated to see him go. You know you're a good friend when your friends hate to see you go. And that's what we find in Job's life. Before we talk about everything that they did wrong, the first thing that I want to do is talk about everything that they did right. And that first sign of Job's problems, here's what they did. They came, they sat with him for 7 days. I know that you're suffering and that you're going through a problem. But one of the things that could ail some of your problems and bring a little bit of perspective to your problems is to spend time with other people who are suffering. And what I'm trying to say simply is this. I know that you're going through a hard time, but there's also somebody else in your life that's going through a hard time. And the question that I simply want to ask you is not if you can do something for them. The question I have for you is what can you